afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. Today, this is episode number 57, and today Maggie and I are joined by some really fun guests. We have the development team for the Lord of the Rings Return to Moria with us here today. John Paul is the director of the game. John, would you like to maybe you could introduce the other members of your team?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. I'm John Paul Dumont. I'm the game director. I work at Free Range Games. We are the developer on Return to Moria. With us is Bradley Fulton, who is the art director on the project, and Farah Khan, the narrative designer and head writer.
Excellent. So for people, I'm sure many people have heard about this. I've been hearing lots of things, lots of great things. I was just in Denver at one of our conferences, and somebody came up to me at lunchtime and he's like, I do nothing but play Return to Moria these days. It's like, I'm all about it. I've been hearing lots of great things. So again, many of you, of course, will have heard of it. But for people who are new to the concept, why don't you just give a little brief description of Return to Moria and what it's sort of about, what it's doing.
Yeah, Return to Moria is a survival crafting game set in the Fourth Age of Middle-earth. So you play as a dwarf who has answered the call of Gimli. This is about 70 years after the ring was destroyed. And he has made a call to all of the dwarves across Middle-earth to come together and to go back into Moria and reclaim it as Khazad-dûm. And then events transpire that make it not as easy as you thought it was going to be. And so that's where the survival and the crafting comes from, is you play either by yourself or up to 8 players on PC. And that group of players, that group of dwarves, gets trapped inside Moria and has to figure out what to do, how to get out, and along the way uncover mysteries that explain maybe the bad luck of the dwarves over the last 1,000 years, why it's not so easy to just walk right in, and a whole lot of things that you discover as you play.
Yeah, awesome. The frame, that there are a couple really important and interesting things, I think, that make this game such a fascinating kind of departure from not only games, but even from really any adaptation that's been done of Tolkien so far. The Rings of Power was interesting. The TV series was interesting because it was the first ever, what I call fill in the blanks adaptation, right? Where we're not just getting a retelling of Tolkien's major works, but we're getting stories within that world, consistent. It's supposed to be working within that narrative, but doing its own thing and telling a story Tolkien never told in full. You guys are doing that too, which is really exciting. But the two things that are different about what's happening in Return to Moria are, first, the time frame, right? That you're telling a Fourth Age story, which has never been done before. Not even Tolkien succeeded at that. so that's pretty cool. And then secondly, the way that you guys are really kind of investing in dwarves and dwarf culture, which is never, not that no one's ever done anything with dwarf culture before, but
not usually the focal point.
Right, exactly. Yeah. They've been sort of, well, I don't want to say slighted, because of course it starts with the book, right? I mean, we get Gimli, who is, I don't want to call him a token dwarf, because that sounds too slighting, but like, he's our solitary dwarf, right? The one representative of dwarf perspective and dwarf culture. And obviously we get more dwarves in The Hobbit, of course, but in The Lord of the Rings, Gimli's it from one end to the next, right? And so a lot of, especially Lord of the Rings fans, learn more about the dwarves in, the end of Appendix A, and, would love to learn more. They certainly, the dwarves have been a fascinating frontier. So there's a sense in which you're not only doing a fill-in-the-blank story in terms of narrative, right? Writing a story in Tolkien's world that Tolkien didn't write, but you're also doing like a world building fill in the blank, essentially, where you're doing a whole bunch of world building, which Tolkien never explicitly did. So that's a double challenge, and in my opinion, from an adaptation standpoint, really kind of a double point of interest. What are some things that you guys, just like sort of experiences that you had, just kind of thinking about the challenges that come along with those two things? What are some things that you guys we're sort of finding along the way are kind of ways that guidelines that you set, for yourselves and stuff for managing that.
Yeah, why don't I take kind of a high level, and then I think Bradley can talk about the sort of how we depicted the world, and Farah could get into some of the history we had to flesh out. We got to the Fourth Age and dwarves. We started with Lord of the Rings and what would be the right survival crafting for Lord of the Rings, and of course it sort of just hit us like a thunderbolt that dwarves was the right answer, being survivors and crafters, almost straight from Professor Tolkien's words. And from there, we looked at, well, first we always knew we wanted to be lore forward, that we wanted to be true to the books, even if that would cause us some issues down the road. But the main sources we had for information were The Hobbit, the Council of Elrond, the Moria, the 3 Moria chapters in Fellowship and Appendix A. And then a little bit that Gimli sprinkles throughout, although when you go back and really start to mine things that he said, probably the Glittering Caves, the Aglaron section, after Helm's Deep, that's kind of it. The rest is like flavor and contrast with Legolas and things like that.
Yeah.
But those were the places that became our main focal points and where we drew almost everything from.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
from a visual standpoint, I think one of the really interesting challenges is that Tolkien's his descriptions are fairly light. His visual descriptions are fairly light. Like the time that the Fellowship spends under the mountain, most of his descriptions are spent really kind of framing the scale of the space, and then the challenges at each of the days of their journey. There's only a few places where he gets into some real kind of meaty detail about exactly what the space looks like. And yet, here we are in the 2020s, and we all have a kind of a shared sense of what dwarvish stuff is and dwarvish stuff looks like. And one of the really interesting things about that is that a lot of that is material that's been added after the fact by people who are, creating their own interpretations of Tolkien, and that kind of material gets sort of passed on, hand to hand to the next people to come along, and right. At the same time, we wanted to directly engage with the source material. So it was a really interesting challenge to try to take kind of what we know instinctively as dwarvish stuff,
right?
Dwarvish visual culture, whether it be their architecture or their, the style of dress, but then try to inject some fresh ingredients so that it feels both authentic and original. And we really kind of tried to tackle that on two fronts: one, the space, and then also just their props, the things they made, since it's a crafting game.
Yes. Yeah. Bradley, great to hear you bring that up, because that's such a complex navigation to try to do, right? When you're because you're not just dealing with the source text. You're dealing with the source text and all the adaptations that came before, of course, especially the Peter Jackson films, as iconic as those have been for so many years. I think a lot of the reactions, not by any means all, but many of the reactions that people were having, for instance, to the Rings of Power, was really less, this doesn't match what Tolkien says in the books, and more, this doesn't look and feel exactly like the Peter Jackson movies do, and so it strikes me as wrong because that's what I've, how do you manage those kinds of expectations? How do you walk that line that you were describing between, like, we don't just want to make it completely detach it because we want it to feel familiar, and yet you don't, it's not like the aesthetic chosen for around dwarves and Khazad Dûm is the only one possible to choose and is now a law for the rest of time, right? So yeah, right. It's a huge challenge.
Right. It's one of the interesting wrinkles of adaptation is adapting the stories to the medium. So if we were, for instance, simply fleshing out the Fourth Age in writing, we'd be able to match the tone, the style, the pace, and the cadence from the books, because it's one-to-one, medium to medium. Ring of Power had to adapt for television and a modern television audience, and we had to adapt for a video game audience and a particular kind of video game interaction. And so we always had to look at it as, did are we trying to be very true to an actual physical space and an actual history that the professor laid out? Or are we trying to be true to the tone and the feel and the attempt to tell a fairy and myth story? And where, when those two things collide, do we make a choice?
Right.
And so it's the medium itself really does affect how you try to adapt something.
Yeah, there's a when you talk about adaptation, the real focus is really about the experience of the audience, and every audience is different depending on the medium. So for a video game, it's like it's an immersive in a different kind of way, you know. So their players are exploring and finding these little tidbits rather than us necessarily telling them the story or the history or something like that. So, and how they find things, when they find things, will differ between each player as well. So trying to find those moments of sharing that information and how it's shared as well, it plays into a lot of when we're thinking about adaptation.
Yeah, it is. So Maggie, go ahead.
I was just saying, and you've said that it's very lore forward, which we've certainly seen amongst the Tolkien community, how impressed everyone is with the use of the lore in it. What's your background in relation to the lore? Were you guys coming at it from knowing all of the minute detail and wanting to include all of this and make it discoverable? Because that's kind of what it feels like, that you know the story that you want them to discover, but you're planting those seeds hoping that they find that one because that one's real good, you know?
Yeah, you know, in terms of background, I think we, like everybody that is in the fandom, comes to it in so many different ways. I mean, for me, I read the books when I was a kid, read them again when I knew the movies were coming out in 2000, and then have read them many times since, which many of us could claim to. But this is my third Lord of the Rings game that I've worked on. I was a combat designer on Lord of the Rings: The Third Age. Then there was an EA role-playing game that unfortunately didn't get out to audiences, and I was a content design and lore master for that team, and so I had to like really immerse myself in that and have a lot of scrutiny of that team. And I wish that work could have gotten out because it was a fun idea. And then went on a long gap where I always wanted to get back to working on Lord of the Rings games. So when this opportunity came up, I jumped right into it. But you know, so that's kind of my history with it. I think Farr and Bradley have a different one. We also did part of the license agreement with Middle-earth Entertainment was to bring on experts and to help us, and that every member of the team had to read the books, which we enforced very strictly. We had a book club every week, and we went through everything, and we were pulling little bits apart. And at this point, I probably read those.
You think it'd be step one for most adaptations, but no.
We actually had two book clubs. So like we ran through the books with one group of people, and then we ran again because the project went as long as it did. So we're able to go through the books again with whoever else wanted to join, or if there was new people that might have joined the project at that point, or just wanted to go over it again. Like I certainly was in both book clubs.
And then I poured through the Tom Shippey books, you know, everything I could get my hands on to try to shove into my head to help.
Yeah.
Same with you, Bradley.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the first time I read the books was a little bit later in life than I think a lot of people started my nerd stripe. It was later. It was in the college years. But at the time, even, it was pretty, like, there was sort of like an awakening of like, oh, that's where all this stuff comes from.
Yes.
You know, there's like, this is the bedrock of just this kind of fantasy nerddom, you know, writ large.
Right.
And so for me, you know, working on this game, but also working on this segment of the world that he created and sort of the world building that the game demanded was like, this is one of those sort of bucket list kind of things, you know, that it marries the motivations, the reasons why I got excited about making video games to begin with the source material that's like the inspiration for everything.
The richest you could tap in.
Yeah.
You know, I joked about the double-edged sword of being lore forward. Farr and I ran into an issue in our first play test over a year ago at this point, where we had so immersed ourselves in the world and the lore So what happens in the game is Gimli and his group are trying to get into the front door, the door of Durin. They can't. They don't really know why. So they decide to go to a sort of drastic measure, and that drastic measure backfires on them, and then your character gets blocked. And so the very first thing that we thought players would do in the game, Far and I were like, well, of course, what would you try to do? You try to get to the door of Durin, and that would be east of here, or west of here. And so they're going to immediately go west. And so we just figured everybody playing the game would have an encyclopedic knowledge of where they were on the mountain and where the door would be and how to get there. And of course they'd see this giant staircase and say, oh, well, this is where the Fellowship was after the Watcher. And so we realized, oh, we went too far.
Too deep.
And we assumed we wanted to make a game like for fans by fans, but we went so far that there was going to be a very small number of people that actually knew how to navigate the space. And so we had to back it up a little bit and start making it a little, telling you what to do a little bit, but also maybe loosening up what players could do early in the game.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Like, how do you deal with that? Because obviously they're not all lore masters. So, how do you make it appeal to the generic audience that's never read a Tolkien text? They just might know that trailer of The Hobbit or whatever.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. I think you try to stay true to the things that make the story exciting to begin with. Dwarves are very interesting characters. There's another reason why they were just a particularly good selection for this. I said, a survival crafting game, that part came first. And you're like, well, who would be the protagonist of such a game? Like, that comes naturally. And also, the way that Tolkien kind of uses, each of the groups within, each of the peoples of Middle-earth as kind of an expression of some aspect of humanity. Dwarves make a very interesting aspect of humanity. In some ways, they're kind of like a foil for hobbits.
Right.
They're sort of the industrious side.
Right.
And that also married really well with a co-op, multiplayer game where, players tend to kind of goof around. So you lean into that, lean into the dwarvishness, and you will find that it'll be something that's just very accessible and resonates with players.
Yeah.
For me, it was I took a step back and was like trying to focus on, as a player, as an audience, just telling a good story at its core. That's what we want to do. Even in a game medium, we want to tell a good story that fits the world of Professor Tolkien. So with that, one of the things I had done even before joining this project, because I just like to see people's reactions to the Lord of the Rings movies, and I get fascinated with like new people coming into watching the movies, what kind of things that they react to, what kind of things gets them excited, what things they pick up. So I had already watched a few like reaction videos of people watching the Lord of the Rings movies and just seeing the things that they were getting, that they were picking up. So I was like, how can we incorporate that level of excitement and enjoyment for a new audience that is not aware of the Lord of the Rings at all?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it is. One of our viewers, Nameless Arcanum, was just asking, how much did you factor in players who are going to just like skip the lore entirely? How do you engage with them as well as, the sort of deep divers?
Yeah, it's a good question. This particular kind of game that we tried to tell, or the story we tried to tell within the context of the game, I think you hit on it, where so much of it is world building and just making sure that the world was built consistently, that there's little bits you can pick up, but with the exception of kind of the early part, the end of the game, and little bits of what push you forward, you could ignore the whole loreness if you wanted to and just play through the progression loops of moving into a new area, upgrading your stuff, going into a harder area. And with a team our size, which wasn't a big AAA game, there are teams out there that are selling their game for $70 and they spent 6 times the amount of money we did, where they can do lots and lots of fancy cutscenes, rendered cutscenes, in-game stuff, have lots of dialogue, lots of NPCs. We knew we had to really focus in on a couple of key things. So we wanted to make sure that if you were a Lord of the Rings fan, that you would immediately feel like, oh, this feels familiar, but it's something new. It's not a retelling. And we wanted to make sure that the progression of the game felt very natural, that you just kind of got in and you got into a zone and started playing. And those were the two places that we really had to focus. And then over the course of the next year and beyond, as we continue to add and update the game, that's where I think we can layer in even more stuff for anybody, not just people that love Lord of the Rings. But we knew we want, if we only hit one thing, it was, if you like this kind of game and you like Lord of the Rings, this is the game for you. And I think we hit that mark. Mm-hmm. And then, like I said, as a small team, we get to grow into the other areas where we can improve.
Right.
I think also just one more point about the lore, how we deliver lore to players who maybe aren't going to search it out or stop to read, the copious amounts of kind of background material that we sprinkle throughout the game. And that's the songs. That singing is an important mechanic in this game for, maintaining your stamina and your energy when you're mining and doing a number of other activities. And the songs are all ways of packaging up, small bits of lore and then telling it through something that's just inherently entertaining in its own right. And so everyone's going to get at least that level of kind of engagement with the lore of the game.
Yeah. I remember I was so excited when I found out that singing was going to not only just, there wasn't just going to be music, but like that singing was going to be a mechanic. I was like, oh man, there we go. It's real now. It is so much fun. Yeah, that is awesome. And yeah, I mean, you can see how some of the, you talk about how, you enable, players to, advance and, build things and do stuff, and they don't have to care particularly, like when you move into a new area and the new like relics that you're finding and stuff that you're working with is like remnants of the old dwarf houses from the Blue Mountains, refugees of whom moved to Moria. Like, you don't have to know that, or you don't have to care about that, but if you do, it's pretty cool when you're like, hey, this is from like the dwarves of Belagost. Okay, right, I see where we are now. So yeah, it's really fun to see how that stuff can get kind of overlaid, and yet again, not just be so totally immersed that it's not going to be, that like it depends upon you having that level of geekiness.
But I also think it's that level of geekiness that resonates so well with the fandom that makes something last longer, Mm-hmm. Like if you were just doing the occasional little blip to try to tick the box, like everybody's going to figure that out real quick. So the fact that you do kind of do the deep dive and you allow that lore to be in all the places if people want to engage with it, that's what I think makes these things last longer. People mm-hmm. are going to keep engaging with it because it's as engaging as the original. So yeah. Tip my hat.
I mean, like, part of it is that, like, so much of that already exists, and we're just kind of tapping into it and, like, expanding upon it. And, like, so it was an opportunity to just find those little connections for the dwarves. I think, Corey, earlier you mentioned that, it is a fourth age story, and we haven't really had much story from the dwarves' perspective, so here we have an opportunity to find those little nuggets and kind of resurface them and make connections that might not have been very clear. And maybe there are players that are not aware of the lore, that are not as interested in the lore, and we're hoping that, I'm hoping that, if they find a nugget of information, they'll be like, oh, that's really interesting, now I want to go back and read more about it, I want to go find out more about it, I'm going to start diving into it as well.
Yeah, and I think that, the ways in which within the game you can discover there's so many different like archaeological layers, right, of story that you can discover, history, right, that you can discover as you go through, right, from the evidence of the fellowships passing through, right, at the end of the Third Age, to Gandalf was there and did something there right before, Aragorn was there and did something there before, and then of course Balin's whole expedition and what were they doing, and more of the circumstances of their destruction, but then of course, and then the ancient Khazad-dûm stuff, but there are layers there too, right? There's like Khazad-dûm as it was like in its final stages before its fall, and then the more ancient Khazad-dûm, underneath that, and like the time with the refugees, right, at the end of the First Age and beginning of the Second Age, and then all the way back to Durin the First himself and his original like activities and plans and things. So there, it's really neat how, again, Moria is just such a golden opportunity, right, to present this sort of a situation where, and again, and all of that, if you have somebody who doesn't care, like who's there, like they want to build, they want to have fun building stuff and developing, because the whole progression of I'm starting from scratch and I'm going to eventually be, finding ways to forge mithril stuff is like, that's pretty cool, right? To be able to, and then to be able to build stuff. I know that there are many people who are, and I am sure will be, interested in the game as like really awesome, like Minecraft in Middle Earth, basically, and that's really cool too. But if you are interested in the lore, there's all of that stuff to be found and discovered. And I think it's pretty cool.
So if I can ask, just like procedurally, how did you start doing this? Like, what was your step one of like creating the outline and then the bullet points of story, which, I would think that would be a fire question, but it's probably all of you, isn't it? Of just filling in all of those spaces to build out this story.
Well, it's really started with John Paul. I kind of came into it once they had already somewhat of a structure of the story of what they wanted to tell. So I'll let John Paul go first. Bradley.
Yeah, I think when Bradley and I were on the project from the very beginning, and we knew we wanted to do dwarves, and one of the things that I felt like, especially from my prior experience, was I didn't want to tell the same story that we've seen before. So we had talked about, well, where could we set it? What kind of narrative or environment could we have? We talked about like the fall of Erebor or even rebuilding of Erebor. We talked about the founding of one of the mountains. We thought about being just total sandbox and no story and just your dwarves in the mountain. But I think we kept coming back to just Moria. The word Moria, it's a scary place. And so then we thought, okay, well, what's a Moria story that would have stakes? Because that's the thing, you take away the ring, then what are the stakes? And so we thought, well, it could have been, because it could have been the founding, it could have been Balin's company. We thought about that, but you know where it goes. And that's where we kind of went back to Middle Earth Entertainment, was like, what do you guys think about the Fourth Age? He talks about them going back. That would be stakes really high for the people. And so once we got that all aligned, that was something that was good for us to start playing with, then that was when we can start layering in, all right, well, how do we get you inside? Is it, is Durin the Seventh just there and you're starting from him or even playing him? Is it something else? And a lot of it came down to the genre really feels good when you kind of start sort of naked and alone and in danger. And so we had to figure out what would be an inciting incident that would get you to the point where you're in danger and then you need to face Moria. And so that was kind of the starting point for what the story could be. But a lot of the first half of the first year, I think, was really the world building. What would be on the west side? What would be on the east side? Is it one big city all the way? What's already been fleshed out that we know of? Where would be the mithril loads? So a lot of it was starting to construct a map that would make sense for us. And Bradley could probably speak to this, how can we make sure you're not just in a dusty, dark cave for 100 hours of play?
Right. Which was the Fellowship's experience, right? I mean,
right.
Yeah.
And so we kind of, this is an approach that you might take in many different kinds of video games, but you want to kind of lay out, the starting point for the art direction of the world, but you start with a lot of inspirational concept and bring on a team of concept artists. And what we did is just laid out the world kind of in sequential order, whether or not that's the order the players are actually going to experience it. Mm-hmm. But especially in the beginning, when you're really trying to, hook people and get them to understand the parameters of this world, the first thing we knew we wanted to do was hit you with, this is the Moria, but you can now look left and right. You couldn't do that when you were reading the book. You couldn't do that when you were watching the movie. They had a goal. They had to go. And there was, the story required them to be at certain points in the under the mountain at certain times. But you're going to have freedom to move. And so, fleshing out, stage right and stage left. And then once we give that to you in that beginning period, that early zone where you're getting your feet, maybe you've never played a survival crafting game before, and we're going to throw you some challenges, just basic stuff, shelter, food, etc. Then we're going to throw you a curveball, and we're going to show you something that you didn't expect to see under the mountain. And not to spoil anything, I'm sure it's been seen, but that's where the Elven Quarter comes in. And that was part of us trying to, it was our first opportunity to think about Khazad-dûm as a setting and go back to the Second Age and, try to pull in some of these threads. And, if somebody has only a passing familiarity with Middle-earth, they might not know the degree to which elves and dwarves might have been friends. They might not have expected to see them cohabiting.
Yes.
And then the exchange, one little anecdote, the furniture that you'll find, the ruined furniture of ancient Khazad-dûm you'll find, a lot of it is wooden, and wood is an elvish material. From a dwarvish perspective, it's an elvish material, and in some ways, it's like a luxury good, right? They had to trade for that wood, and one of the things that comes with that is elvish style. And so that was something we tried to do in, creating the concepts for those things, is that there's this kind of fusion between dwarf and elf. Mm-hmm. But that, it's the whole rest of the world building kind of plays out in that same way, sort of thinking like, okay, you experience this, now what's next? And each next thing, is another 90-degree turn that takes you, you get to the mines, the concept art that you've got behind you, Corey. You get to the mines and you're like, that's right. Here's how big this mountain is. And it's also not a place, it's a place I'm excited to explore as a player, but as a dwarf, I'm a little nervous about the dangers that I'm going to face,
Right.
And then carry on until we get to the other side of the mountain.
Yeah.
And to bring Farah in, one of the things that we had to do once we had the idea of the layout of the world and we knew we wanted to tell an adventure story, we had to start to figure out, we had to kind of answer some things. And that's where Farah kind of jumped in, which is what happened in the year between the Balrog's emergence and the evacuation of Khazad-dûm. Why did they stick around for a year in that way? And then, how does that relate to why Durin hasn't come back? And we had to start to form some opinions. And Corey, this is something you helped us with, was what was the philosophy, the spiritualness of the dwarves? What do the dwarves actually believe about, whether it's, quote, true? Right. What do the dwarves believe about themselves? Why do they exist? What is their role, and why would they stay in this place? And so that's, what were each Durin? And so that was a lot of what Farah helped us kind of write and flesh out.
Yeah, I jumped in thinking about those things as if I was almost writing like a history book. Like if I was a dwarf and I was going back to Khazad-dûm as an architectural exercise, or an archaeological exercise rather, and trying to figure out what is the history of, the belief systems of the dwarves, of why did they come to Khazad-dûm in the first? Why did the first Durin come to Khazad-dûm in the first place? How do we tie that in to what is actually underneath the mountains? How do we tie that into some of the mysteries that, I don't want to spoil it right now, but some of the mysteries that we have included in the game? I tried to tie it in as if the dwarves believe that this is their home, and this is why Durin the Deathless first came here, there needs to be a reason, not just he saw a reflection in the lake of the crown and whatnot. I wanted to give it a little bit more. So we started digging into that, and it's how do we tie it into the mysteries that we do have, so we're not just making things up for the sake of making things up, or extrapolating ideas for no reason. We wanted to tie it in very closely to what was happening with the dwarves in Khazad-dûm at every stage of the history that we do know. Yes. And then we can fill in the gaps as we go. So yeah, then we was discussing why was the other Durins, why did they appear when they did appear? What were their beliefs? And just going into those levels of history essentially, and their belief systems, and then trying to think about okay, well, where in Khazad-dûm, in these locations that we've already set out, where do we showcase some of that? How far did they go, and where can we kind of resurface some of that information? You have Nain, we mentioned they evacuated a year later, and it was after Nain's death. So like, how can we firstly make it a much more dramatic kind of moment as a dwarf revisiting that scene? And then also, how does it tie into the larger dwarven story?
Yeah. I just love the way.
Yeah.
yeah. I just love the way, like the kinds of questions that you're leaning into. Like that seems to me just like at the heart of what makes adaptation so much fun.
It's the right path coming from adaptation people. This is the right path that you have followed.
One of my most one of my favorite sort of, I don't want to call it Easter egg, but little touches that really involves Briley and Farah collaborating together is there are moments in the game where you find a statue to one of the Durins.
Yes.
And you can you rebuild it and you sing it. And there's two touches to that goes to Farah's work as an archaeologist and an anthropologist of Khazad-dûm, which is that the verse, so you don't find them in order. You don't find Durin 1's statue and then Durin 2nd statue. You find them out of order. And the order you find them correspond to the verse from Gimli's Song of Durin. And each statue actually reflects the time of what was going on. So you actually start with a very proud Durin the First, but he was a builder, he wasn't adorned. Then you get to Durin the Second, and he's adorned as a king with the crown. And by the time you get to Durin the Sixth, he's holding the crown because he's almost not holding his head high anymore, because they're not at the height anymore. And so there's that whole thing. It's very subtle. But I just love that little nuance of by the time you get to the ash, the forage's fire is ash and cold, that's the Durin the Sixth verse. That's the Balrog took them, everything is lost kind of verse.
Yeah. It's funny, John Paul, it's funny you mentioned that because that's exactly what I was thinking of while Farah was talking. It's my favorite piece of concept art. So I didn't say this at the beginning, probably should have done, that I was consulting with you guys during the thing. I know like sometimes I'm like asking questions as an interviewer and sometimes I'm talking about my own experience with it too. So anyway, I'm not trying to like pull a fast one on anybody or conceal that fact. But I remember during the process, it was my favorite piece of concept art that you guys showed me, was that the statues, the concept art for the statues of the six Durins, and it was I could teach like a 2-hour class on that image, like just kind of going through and like what it suggests about the the history of Khazad-dûm and where we can see it, and thinking about the correlation with the poem and stuff. Oh man, it is.
And your involvement. I mean, one thing I want to mention is that I knew, because I followed your podcast and I've been joking with you since we made contact, because the whole first year of the project I would watch your weekly series. I'm like, at some point I got to talk to this guy. But in my head I was like, what's going to happen first? The exploring Lord of the Rings gets to Moria or the game ships? And I'm shocked we beat you.
You beat us, yeah.
We did.
I'm not shocked at all.
Not by that much, but
not by that much. I was like, oh, it's going to happen. But your involvement, just for I think people might think is interesting, is the whole first year we actually worked with a fellow named T.S. Luckhart, who worked on tabletop role-playing games in the Middle-earth world, and with David Sallow, the language expert. So by the time we had brought you on, and I know Farah and I had talked about this, I was like, I had made contact with you, but we wanted to wait until we felt like we had the world and the story fleshed out. So rather than you help us assemble the world,
right,
we wanted to have it and then put it in front of you as a gauge of, did we hit something that felt true to the tone, or was Crazy Town? Because everyone has their own idea of what's too far, and so that's when you came on. We handed you a full treatment, and we were like, just please tell us, did we go too far? Does this feel right? And then, then we spent a year kind of talking about all these different things and tuning it and polishing it. But there was a lot already there when you first came to it.
Oh, there was. And it was so much fun to go through that stuff and sort of see what you guys were thinking. And Farah, as I was mentioning before, the questions that you were mentioning, like the questions that you, first of all, that 1 year thing, I want to come back to that, because that is that's such a common Tolkien thing, by the way. Like, there's so many places where you look at when you really stop and think about like dates that he puts, And there's a whole untold story just in the one number, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, most people won't even notice. I mean, I bet you that the kind of visual like image that people have when they think about, oh, well, the Balrog woke up and the dwarves left, is like a vague picture of like dwarves like running and screaming as the Balrog comes up, and like the, you know, and Khazad-dûm was evacuated in about 15 minutes, right? I mean, like that's kind of the picture, I think, that the kind of unexamined image that people have. But then you look at it and you're like, no. They lived with they cohabitated with the Balrog for a year, right? What was that like? What was going on? And so taking moments like that and really thinking, what does that mean? Like, not only what was that year like, but what does it tell you about their society? I mean, so anyway, finding those things and leaning, and the other thing, just to emphasize, Farah, again, that critical question that you asked, because again, it's one of those things which is so much fun, because it's a question that so many people never think to ask. But once you ask it, it seems like inevitable, and you really want to know the answer, right? And the answer is, why does Durin settle at Khazad-dûm? Why does he build his, and the answer, there's an obvious answer to that question, like, right? Like, you know, tens of thousands of Tolkien fans could give the answer to that question, but it doesn't answer it, in fact, right? And the answer is, well, because he saw the crown above his head in the mirror. Yeah, but why? Right? He saw the crown and took it as a sign that he was supposed to build his home there. Now, assuming that he was right, that it was in fact a sign, right? So let's take as a working hypothesis that he wasn't making stuff up, right? That indeed he did receive a sign that said he was supposed to. Why? Why was the sign given? Why this place, right? Why? And you know that there should be an answer to that, but of course the text never whispers an answer to that question. And so identifying those kinds of questions, which I think the story sets up as really compelling questions, and yet we don't know the answer. And so having the opportunity to, you know, for you guys as a team to discover that, and again, I so much loved being a part of those discussions and seeing what you guys were thinking and continuing discussions of that, and how for players going through, how they can begin to discover more and more. And as we said, you don't have to pay attention to it, but if you do, there's a lot of really fun stuff to discover in that way. And it kind of leads to all these other questions, right? Like, why was the Balrog there in the first place? Like, okay, yeah, he was running away from the fall of Thangorodrim, but there's a lot of mountains to hide under, right? There's a whole bunch of caves he had to choose from among.
And that's
presumably.
exactly, like, that was one of the, like, I wanted to treat Moria as a character, and like Khazad-dûm, the Misty Mountains, that location, as a character in itself.
Yeah.
So what is the story of these mountains? How were they first created? We even did kind of like go into that, like, you know, we looked into like other books like the Silmarillion, and just to understand like why these mountains were created, who created these mountains, you know, right. Some of that stuff is there. So it's like, what can we pick out of that, and like how would that have been interpreted by the dwarves? Because now we're telling the story of the mountains, but we're also telling it from the perspective of the dwarves. So what is their belief about that? So what we're saying might not be true at all, but we're saying it from the dwarven perspective. Like, this is potentially what they might have believed.
And that's the thing that's so much fun, right? There's a sense, there's a kind of freedom there, right? Because we know some things from the first age about like what happened and stuff. We know it from the Elvish perspective, right? I mean, like, because everybody knows the Silmarillion was written by elves, right? I mean, that's and I would imagine there would be a number of things in the Silmarillion accounts where dwarves would grumble and say, oh, okay, all right, we could tell you the true story of what was really going on there, right? And so, yeah, being able to have, so even down to some fundamental things, like about their own relationship with Aule, the smith who made them. They're going to have a very, it's like their whole core theology and understanding of themselves is going to be not only, but again, there's this other wonderful thing that Tolkien did, right? When he said, like, the dwarves don't tell anybody else. So it becomes this not exactly,
definitely leaned into that.
Yeah, not a wholly blank slate, but it means there's a lot of room to move there.
Yeah, but you play within the rules.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Maggie.
I was just saying, you play within the rules to be creative.
Yeah, that question you brought up of why did the Balrog go there?
Yeah.
That's one that honestly I've been spinning on for a decade.
Right.
And so when this game came up, I was like, oh, I've got this weird theory about why in my own headcanon, and I'm going to try this on some experts and see how weird it is. And it was sort of found to be, oh, that could work too. Because that's the thing. And as we've done press for the game, we've been asked a lot of like, is our game canon?
Right.
And that's an interesting question. And I think when we've talked about, what is canon? Is it could anything be canon that wasn't in the novels? Even the Silmarillion was pieced together from notes and wasn't necessarily his so what's canon? I don't know anymore. But our game is trying to be consistent with the themes of the world and feel like it could be. To a one player, they might say, for me, this is canon, and I think that's a totally valid question or way to go about it.
Yeah.
Like one of the key things that we did as well was create a timeline of what was happening. Like what was the key moments in Dwarven history, especially associated with Khazad-dûm. And then going beyond that, of going like, well, what was happening in the world as well? Like what was happening with the elves and the humans and like the big wars that were happening, and because, especially with the Durins, there was a few Durins that we don't know when they were alive. We kind of have like a time frame of when they could have been alive, but it's not really specified. So we had to kind of go in and be like, well, if we are creating these statues and we have like our own vision of how these the Durins would have looked like and behaved, how does it tie in to what's happening in the world? How can we make it more consistent with the things that we don't know? How can we make it consistent with the things that we do know?
Yeah it's
Yeah, because the flip side of the argument that dwarves keep these things to themselves is that when you set a game in a place where it's only dwarves, what do they say to each other? You know what I mean? That also comes to, well, what do we do with the dwarven language as well? It's like this is it. They would be talking to each other in Kustal, and so this is something that we need to really kind of bring together and turn into a feature.
Yes. So one of the things that Maggie and I have often talked about as a fundamental and very often overlooked element of adaptation, like when people are looking at film adaptations and comparing them to a book, one of the things that Maggie has taught me to think about is that people almost always overlook the fact that one of the biggest, most fundamental differences between those two stories is the fact that one of them was written by a person and the other one is a really complex team of dozens of different creative people working many different angles and all coming together in order to, and like the different ways in which those things come together and combine can have a radical impact on some of the things which seem to viewers as like fundamental adaptation decisions, right? Obviously with video game production you're in a similar world. It's why fun to have the three of you here, and of course I know that there were other people who are working on this as well. Talk about that, about how the kind of team approach, how this is not just like a kind of a single author adapted story or something like that, but the ways in which you guys kind of were working together and how the team production happened.
That's probably a good question for Bradley, I think.
Yeah, I think I touched a little bit on this in the response to Maggie's question. We were talking about like kind of where do you start, but I think in the role as art director, I think one of your first jobs is to inspire the team. Before you can inspire players, you need to kind of get everybody on board. Everyone's going to bring their own ideas to the thing, and most of those ideas are going to be really good ideas that can find a home, but sometimes they'll be conflicting, and that's the team building and the collaborative process is kind of hammering things down, and really everyone understanding like what are the bones of this world, what are the bones of the game, what makes the game fun and interesting. So the first job is to actually, before I can even inspire the team, I have to inspire the artists. So getting really talented concept artists. Of course, when you're working on a Lord of the Rings game, it can be easier to find people who are already right from the go. I don't have to try to get them to buy into Middle Earth. Like they're already there.
They're already there.
But then I have to narrow it down to like what are the problems that you can really dive into and get the best and the most out of them, and then you leverage that to then inspire the team, and then you get there's like an audio texture to it, and then everyone can kind of experience the vibe of the game just visually and through sound and through storytelling, and then that's where everything starts to take shape. It's a constant collaborative work is a challenge, and there's a skill to it for sure that we all learn over the course of doing this, but I think that's where you start with that inspiration.
That makes sense. You're trying to get everybody to have a singular vision with a ton of different brains that look at things and think of things in very different ways. So having that kind of imagery behind the people who are creating the space makes a whole lot of sense to me. And then you fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like within our team,
go ahead,
we had like a lot of people who love these stories, that love the books, and everyone, like, at least from a lore perspective, like everyone was bringing a lot to the table, and our job was to just make sure, like, yeah, it makes sense for the lore, it makes sense for our story, but we also did have like a lot of limitations just because the nature of video games and just the resources that we had, the time that we had. Like, there's a lot of things I would have loved to have included, and we just didn't have time. Like, that's just the nature of something like a project like this. But so my what I tried to take on was like, that's if somebody had an idea, it's like, that's fantastic, let's try to find a way to include it. And like everyone is so skillful and experienced in what they're doing on this team as well. Like, there was that trust of like, they will figure it out and how to include it as well, because like there's expertise that I don't have in terms of making video games that they do, and it's just like there's a lot of storytelling that happens just through gameplay, through environment, through songs, and so many, like, music and just sounds even. There's so many aspects of storytelling that came through that I didn't even touch, but it fits the world, and it makes that world building aspect that makes it so wonderful and brilliant.
Yeah. So just to pass through a couple quick questions. Mrs. Manrique was just asking, what's your guys' favorite part of the game, and why is it beer drinking?
Man, the beer stuff was fun. That was one of the things, was a core value of the game was do everything the dwarfiest way possible. And so that's when I think I don't know if we were talking or when we were brainstorming, but it was like, oh, you know what it was? It was one of our gameplay engineers early on, and when we were making our first sort of gameplay demonstration, had put in health potions. And I had this reaction to it. And then I thought, I was like, why was I reacting to it? I was like, they're not going to carry a potion around. And then we're like, well, what would they carry? Well, they'd carry a beer. They'd have an ale. And so that's where we started to go, like, how far can we push this? And we pushed it pretty far.
Yeah, and I love the fact that there is not only social drinking, but there are specific mechanics for social drinking songs in the game. Like, that's yeah. It does seem that there was a lot of really fun. I get on just like kind of the fun and playfulness of especially of multi-person play and stuff. That seems like a really sort of apt spirit for the game in that way.
Yeah, one of the things that was really important to us, these games have the genre has a certain set of mechanics and rules, and they typically have very hard, they can be very brutal, they can be very grinding, and we wanted to be true to that, and I think we can still continue to develop the game to get further and further down the line for the genre of survival crafting. But it was also important to us that we wanted to make a game that just had a lot of joy in it. And that's where, like, drinking, the singing, the dancing, the decoration of your base, the fact that you don't just make food and take it with you, you have a meal. So there was a lot of things in there that we wanted to layer in, just that put a whole coat of paint of just joy across everything that we could. Still have a game with stakes and danger and difficulty, but we felt like if anyone was going to have fun in the dark of Moria, in the face of this danger, it would be the dwarves, and so that fit with the dwarfiness we wanted.
Yeah, great. The other question I wanted to pass through quick was a question from Varking Runesong, who's the person I've always thought of ever since I started working on the game, that like this is the video game designed for him personally. Anyways, Varking was asking, you guys have already done tons of updates and fixes, already within, just the first couple of weeks of the game being out. Do you guys sleep? Like, is that not much these days?
No.
We have a hearth and a bedroll.
I need more black diamonds. And we've got another big update coming. We've got our PlayStation 5 release in the first week of December, and that will coincide with another big update. And that's where we're really planning on doing. We heard the community loud and clear, more quality of life when it comes to inventory management, sorting, auto deposit, things like that. And those are going to be in that update. We wish we could have had it at launch, but we're going to have it there. We're making the end of the game stronger. We felt like it needed to be even more experiential, so we're pouring a lot of gasoline on that part of the game. And then we're going to turn around and do another update, and then another update. So part of, I think, the advantage is we've got a really motivated team. We've got fans that seem to really like it, and we want to just keep making it better for them.
Will people be able to cross-play between consoles and the PC?
Not at launch on the PS5.
Okay, not at launch on the PS5. Okay. And is the Xbox launch?
Xbox will be next year.
That'll be next year. Okay. All right. Cool. And some people were asking about DLC and stuff as well, and I know I know it's hard to think too much about that in the midst of update time, patch and update season, but I know that there definitely are thoughts in that direction.
Yeah, and when we talk about DLC, that's pretty far down in terms, especially if you're meaning like paid DLC, like whole new content. That's pretty far down the line. We've got a lot of stuff we want to do that we're not planning on charging for.
Cool. Awesome. Great. Well, I know you guys have to go. You've been very generous with your time. So glad that you guys could join us here today. Maybe we can have another conversation, down the road.
This is just scratching the surface, guys. We could do this for hours.
We could too. Yeah, absolutely. We need to have a spoiler tag one so we can get into the good, bad, and why Aule, why there. There's so much fun stuff that we got into that we loved.
That's exciting parts for us.
Yeah, well, we're all about close reading and stuff. So I mean, if we could get like a single image or a single space and just do that for 12 hours, Corey,
something like that. Yeah. Well, I mean, and even just thinking in more detail about just kind of zooming in on one example of the stuff that you guys were talking about. Like, here's the foundation. Here's what we know from the text. Right now, let's look at in detail. Some of the things that were done with that, where we took that and how those two things are related, to really begin to, again, open up more. It's one of our goals in this whole series, this Other Minds and Hands show, is to kind of, in some ways, like demystify the adaptation process, really kind of be thinking through how you get from one to the other, how you relate to, how you are trying to tell your own story and how that story that you're telling relates to Tolkien's story. So anyway, we'll let you guys go. So viewers, you can hang out. Maggie and I are going to stick around and talk a little bit more, but I want to take the opportunity to thank again and say goodbye to our guests. Thank you guys. Really, really appreciate it. Look forward to another conversation later on. Hopefully when you guys have had a chance to sleep a little bit more.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very good. Thanks, guys. Excellent. Okay.
Well, that wasn't fun at all.
Oh man, there's so much to talk about.
I know. I mean, that was absolutely lovely, but it really felt like first date where I'm like, we need to get into some deeper stuff with them, don't we? Because they know their stuff. This would be fun. They seem really thoughtful. You know them well. Yeah. Very cool.
No, they were so great to work with. It was really neat being, as John Paul was saying, I was brought in relatively late, and just kind of going through the stuff that they had and a bunch of the timelines and details and things and making some suggestions, and it was great. I mean, there's a lot I haven't seen. There's a lot that I don't know about, in the story or, in the game, but
even the bringing you in late thing, sometimes you hear about that, especially industry of they brought him in because this was getting messed up and these people were overreacting and we were worried about the fan reaction. With them, it was so much more strategic. They obviously had lore masters. They knew their stuff. They could do the baseline and then bring it to a higher level lore master. You know, that's a really clever strategy.
It was great. It was great. And like I said, there was someone was asking me this weekend. They're like, okay, so like, were there any like howlers, like, you know, like, was there anything that you saw on the game when they showed it to you that you were like, no, don't do that?
Oh yeah, were there?
No, there was not.
Okay.
There was not.
It strikes me as the team that would have that.
No, I was really excited about a lot of things. I mean, whenever we were working on it, you know, in the meetings that we had, you know, like a year ago and stuff, it was, and mostly it was just like this escalating thing where like a lot of the questions they were asking and the things that they were thinking about made me think about other stuff, and they were like, oh, we didn't think about that, we could do this other stuff too, and then we would, you know, a lot of the kind of the deep lore of the game, the stuff that I won't talk about because even if you've been playing it, you probably haven't gotten there yet. Is again, like, down to like the first stage stuff and the answers to those questions about like why was Durin called to set up his stronghold here. But anyway, so that's a lot of that stuff was stuff that really kind of grew and developed in those conversations that we were having, and it was really fun.
And a question I meant to ask them, but you might know too, when they do the releases on different platforms, does the game change at all, or are they releasing the current version on that platform?
There will be, I mean, and here I'm just, I know nothing about the technical side, but just based on what I've seen in other games, you know, that where I've seen both, you know, platform or both platforms. Usually, like, there'll be visual differences and stuff because of just the way that, like, you know, they work, but I hope and believe that the core, like, you know, elements of like the details in the story of the game will be consistent across them. But Phil is asking, was there anything that made me go, wow, I never thought of it that way? The thing I was referring to, the 6 Durin statues that they had, the element of the story that really kind of came to life to me in a new way when I was looking at the stuff that they were doing, is the actual history of Khazad-dûm itself. I find that it's easy as a reader of the text to kind of freeze, to have this like monolithic, you know, static concept of ancient Khazad-dûm, right? You know, the great civilization of the dwarves, and not think about, you know, rise and fall and variations that are happening within the course of the thousands of years, you know, that this place has been around, and so the ways in which they were teasing out the kind of ebb and flow of the history of Khazad-dûm, and the thoughtfulness with which they were, as Pharaoh was explaining, rooting that in the external events, you know, kind of correlating that with the external events that were going on outside. And then, of course, like, it's going to surprise none of you that, you know, when John Paul was then talking about how that was paralleling stanza by stanza with Gimli's song, I was like, yes, 1,000 times yes. So anyway, it was really cool.
That's fun. But that's the energy you want to see, you know, like when you see us getting all like fangirly about it and you see them kind of responding to it and the levels just get more and more excited. Oh, yeah. That's the vibe you kind of want your story to exist in, because it has this baseline of trust that, all right, whatever you're doing is based on something really pure. So let's do the best that we can with it.
Yep.
Fun.
No, it was neat. It was neat. So it's, I mean, I think I'm hoping, over time that we can do some fun things with the there's a lot to be, you know, to be unpacked and discovered and discussed from what's going on there. And it would be fun to, I have a, you know, fantasy of, you know, doing some stuff where we can kind of, I think there's some things that we could do. It would be really fun to get some of this game world up on the screen and walk around in it. Is what would be really fun to do. And
really, even just some of those simple things, like if we did just look at the Durins and talk about that, just this same thing we've done in so many other episodes, the visual representation of a text and how you can tell a story in a different way. So gameplay is so different. And I love what Farah was saying of like revealing the story through discovery, not just in telling. You don't need tons of narrative because you're going to have somebody explore in a different way to get that story out to you.
Yeah.
But that would be so fun to go through a certain scene with them and just see that process revealed.
Yep. Yeah, no, it would. So we may do, I was talking with some of the not just the development crew, but some of the folks at North Beach Games, which is the production company that's helping with the game, that's publishing the game. Anyways, talking with them a bit about to think about some stuff that we can do together. So we might do some streaming and discussion and stuff later on. So there'll be more opportunities to kind of dig into. Phil says, how about getting it up on the really big screen? Well, I have notions on that subject. I have notions. We'll see what's possible, but it is an avenue that is being explored for sure. But yeah, so I think it's I've been really excited about this game. And of course, for me working on the game, the part, of course, with which I have had like no connection, and because I mean, almost all my connection had been like, story treatments and, narrative and images and things like that. So I was working with Farah and I was working with Bradley mostly, but of course, like the actual gameplay elements of it, right? I'm like, just like hoping that works. And again, it's another thing. It's just another example, Maggie, of like the kind of the team thing, right? Just like you can have, as we've all seen examples of, right? You can have a film that's a brilliant concept, an amazing cast, and then it just flops.
Doesn't work.
Because either the directing's not good or the writing's not good, or like there's, there can be any kind of, if there's any sort of disconnect or any like major weakness in any of those areas, or again, like how many times you're like, man, that film was horrible, but the screenplay was amazing, right? Or like, anyway, just like all these kinds of things. There's so many, in order for a game like this to be a successful adaptation, right? To do what it's doing successfully, all these things have to work. So not just thinking about the lore and the story and the art and the visuals and everything, but the gameplay, and the mechanics and all of this stuff have to also work together to make it really compelling. And so yeah, that was, for that I've just kind of like had my fingers crossed, just like wishing them the best and really hoping that everything comes together, because I was like, man, everything I've seen is really fun. Like, this is really exciting. And I really hope that it's, hope and trust it's going to come together in a way that's going to be, lead to a really effective and good experience for folks.
It's been interesting to see the reaction, because I mean, I haven't gone too deep onto the interwebs, but it seems with most of the fan communities it's been really positive. It's been mediocre with some of the other like big name reviews, but to be honest, that doesn't really surprise me, because that's kind of their job. Like, they're supposed to look at something and be like, oh, this one isn't that great because of, but the people they're pitching and playing it to seem to be having an awfully good time.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I've been hearing too. I have not gotten to play it much myself yet, but I am looking forward to that. I'm planning. I mean, I don't have too much time to play. It's my other issue. But
and I live with an Xbox obsessive, so I figure as soon as it's on that platform, it's going to be in this house. So
right, exactly. So but no, it's something I would like to do more. Just as we were talking about how it would be fun to kind of zoom in and do some close reading of particular moments and particular passages and how they're making that adaptation work in the game. It also would be fun to kind of back up a little bit and look at the wide, because one of the issues that was kind of, I mean, it came up at various points in our conversation today, but would be interesting to kind of look at more systematically is adapting for video games in general. Like, what are the many of the challenges and things, like what does it mean, what are the priorities, and how does that differ from, there are a lot of similarities between adapting for a video game and adapting for a film or TV show, but thinking more about those sort of genre differences and the significance of those, like how that really factors into the kind of adaptation project that you undertake and the kind of adaptation product that you bring forward. There are definitely significant differences there. So anyway, so it would be fun to think about that. In fact, it would be awesome. It would be awesome someday to have like a panel with a bunch of, like get John Paul Dumont from Return to Moria and get like Chris Pearson from Lotro and maybe a couple other people together and just talk about that, Tolkien video games and,
No, that's what we should do in front of the big screen, and then have you guys play a bit and film that.
Yeah.
Fun. Yeah, that would be really cool.
That would be fun. Anyway, yeah. So lots of stuff to do moving forward. And I do agree, Druid's Fire. There is a lot of differences depending on what kind of game it is. Yeah, absolutely. Just as, obviously there are different considerations and there are different challenges in like doing completely different genres of film as well, right? So like to some extent there's a parallel there. Yeah. But I do agree that the kind of lateral differences between totally different genres of game, I think in some ways are likely to be somewhat more like more profound, more fundamental, perhaps.
It's probably closest to like different platforms that we've been talking about, like a 10 1-hour series. Right. 5 series is very different than a 90-minute feature film. Like, right. Yeah, you're going to engage with that story incredibly differently. But gameplay is so different and has such a unique power that it puts you in the space. So having that player interaction, I think, is so powerful narratively. Yeah. That's a really fun way to look at story adaptation. And totally, it's going to completely depend on what kind of game you're playing. If you are actually stepping into a role and building yourself as a dwarf, that's quite different than playing as Gimli.
Right. Exactly. I think back to like some of the like film spin-off console games that like I remember my nephews playing after the Peter Jackson films, right, where you're just basically playing the characters going through the plot of the film, right? Yeah. And that's a totally different kind of undertaking than than certainly than
and crafting and discovering and
yeah exactly. But yeah, I think my favorite moment of that whole interview was at the very beginning, because I don't think they ever said it to me in exactly that way before. I had heard that before, that like, so survival crafting game is the official like name of the genre of game that they were building. And so the idea that they sat down and were like, well, we're going to do a survival crafting game in Middle Earth, and they're like, both survival and crafting, just we're like dwarves, obviously. And I love that.
It wasn't even an aha moment. It was a
duh moment. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Very fitting. I like it. Yeah, we definitely have to do more video games. There's so much to talk about there. Fun fodder.
Yeah, that would be a lot of good stuff. So let me segue for a moment, because there's some important sort of announcements to talk about. I didn't want to take up the time that because we had a limited time with our special guests today, but I wanted to, because today is the first day of Signum's fall fundraising campaign. So I wanted to make sure to mention that for a couple different reasons. Of course, the primary reason is just to remind you, first of all, to thank everybody who has donated to support Signum. Signum, of course, is a tax-exempt institution, and we're really grateful to everybody who donates to support our work. We couldn't do it without you guys. And if you haven't had a chance chance to donate, now is the perfect time because our fall fundraising campaign has begun. One of the things that we always love to do during fall fundraising campaign is give away. It's like the time to like celebrate our community and the people who support us. So here's the thing that we're going to do. We are going to we're gonna do a weekly giveaway just to sort of celebrate everybody who is keeping up with Other Minds and Hands. And so what's going to happen is every week we're going to do a drawing and we're going to give away a choice of 3 prizes. Okay, so here's how it's going to work. We're going to have a form. There's a very simple form. Let me I'll get the link here. Okay, here is the link, and I'm going to post it in the chat. Okay, there's the link to our Other Minds and Hands form. It's very simple. It's just like your name and email. Really, there's nothing else to it. So next week, if you would like to enter into the drawing in celebration of Other Minds and Hands, just fill your name and address on that form. And next week, during next week's session, we will do a drawing for everybody who has filled out the form between now and then. Okay, so this is to be inclusive, not just for people who are here live, but to be inclusive for people, because I know that many people follow along with Other Minds and Hands, but listen or watch asynchronously because they can't be with us at this day and time. So everybody can participate. So just go in and put your name and email, and we'll enter. Now, what are the prizes, you ask? We're going to be giving away a choice of 3 things, and they're pretty cool things. You can get either your choice of a free ticket to one of our regional moots, or to a flight in our space program. So you can get a flight to a 1-month class in our space program, or you can get one of our Anytime Audit archives. That is one of the archived lecture series from one of our graduate courses, one of our MA courses. So you can get an Anytime Audit recording, a set of Anytime Audit recordings. You can get a month of live participation in our space program, or you can get admission to a regional moot. We will do a drawing and give the person the choice of those 3 things. And for those of you who are watching or listening, the link to this will be in the description of the YouTube recording. So if you're listening to this like on the Twitch recording or something like that, or on the podcast feed, go to our YouTube channel and find this episode 57 of Other Minds and Hands, and the link will be in the description there. All right, so those are the prizes you'll be entering a drawing for. So just go ahead and fill in, just put your name and email in that form anytime between now and next week, and we will do a drawing next week. We're doing this weekly throughout the fundraising campaign.
I have an admin thing that I meant to talk to you about beforehand, but we're going to do it live on here.
Okay.
I have the Lovecraft class lecture next week this time, so we might have to think about timing.
Right. Oh, right. Yeah. So next week, that reminds me of the segue to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is next week. So next week we're going to return to our opening series, right? And we were going to continue Jane Austen and do Emma next.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to do our Emma discussion, but we'll do it at a different time.
It might just be a smidge later. I can't remember. I think class starts, I think it's 9 to 10:30, so I think it's its exact slot. So we'll see.
Okay. So we may have to shift to a different day or something. All right. So stay tuned for that. We'll post the new time on Signum's social media, and we'll try to make.
But
sure
appropriately, I am talking about Lovecraft's adaptations, so it's a very fitting class.
There we go. Cool. Awesome. So yeah, we'll make sure to let people know. So next week's will be at an as yet undetermined special time.
We'll decide soon.
Yeah. We'll figure that out. Awesome. This also reminds me of one. So the all of the forms. So when we're collecting people's names and emails for the drawing, at the end. So we're going to be concluding the fall fundraising campaign at our annual webathon event, which will happen on Saturday, December 9th. And on that day, we will do a grand prize drawing of everyone who has filled out the form for during the whole campaign. So we'll have like everyone who's done it at any point in the next like 5 weeks, for a grand prize, an Other Minds and Hands grand prize. And the grand prize for Other Minds and Hands is you get to name the topic of our discussion. We will take you can suggest, we may negotiate depending if you land on something that's way outside the familiarity of both of us, we may negotiate a bit. But we will give you the power to suggest to us a specific topic or a specific work or pairing that you would like to see us discuss in Other Minds and Hands. So we will let you determine one of our discussion topics. That's sort of the grand prize from the drawing that we will do on December 9th at our Webathon event. So anyway, lots of fun stuff happening and coming up. So for Emma next time, did we decide we were going to throw in Clueless as an extra?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
I think we have to talk about them.
So we're going to have 4 things. We're going to have the opening of the book. We're going to have the opening to the Gwyneth Paltrow. We're going to have the opening to the recent one of like 2 years ago, like the 2021, was it? 2020?
Yeah, and I feel like I saw it on Netflix, but I might be lying. But yeah, it's very recent.
Yeah. And then we're going to do, and then also Clueless as well. Yeah. So we will be looking at the openings of all 4 of those texts. And Larry, we have not discussed Dune yet. I think that's where we're going to go next after we could of course continue with Jane Austen. Of course, Jane Austen is not only really fun to discuss, but also of course has been so heavily adapted. We could do it for every single work of Jane Austen. But
also there's limited text, so there's also kind of a nice little bookend, so to speak.
Right. Right. Exactly. But we'll probably, after Emma, we'll probably move on, maybe do Dune at that point, and then
I feel like we need a Christmas something in there, though. I'll see what
as we get closer to Christmas, we can think of. Of course, I
loved Christmas Carol last time. That was really fun.
Yeah. We can think about that. We can think about other options we can do. We also talked about the possibility of doing Little Women as well, which I know is one of your favorites. So yeah.
That would be a lot of fun.
We could do Watership Down too, with the recent
Netflix
one.
I've heard that's got 11.
And Anyway. We also have to put an eventual limit on our opening series, because what we want to do after we do the openings is to go back and do some additional close reading comparisons of these same texts. So having built this sort of body of texts, to then go back and look over them again. So
and to pick like specific moments, of Darcy and Lizzie's confrontation and how they depict that in different ways in different scenes. Yeah. Really fun to do that.
Yeah. Excellent. All right. Very good. Well, so again, pay attention, be on the lookout for announcements about the move of time and possibly day. We'll let you guys know for when we're going to meet next week. But next week we will come back to discussion of Jane Austen adaptations, and then continuing on to some other fandoms and topics after that. We'll think about Christmas stuff. I'm now brainstorming Christmas stuff in my head, but we'll get there.
Like The Grinch is where I went first, because there's been so many good adaptations of that, and Dr. Seuss is kind of a fun place to start.
That's a great suggestion. I love the Grinch suggestion. Yeah.
Think about that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, that would actually be really interesting to also to when the original text is not only a children's book but a picture book, right?
Yeah.
There's so much. There's a totally different relationship then that's going to come in, because there is, unlike many of the things in the written texts, there is so much more visual expectation. Yeah. Oh, very cool. Okay. Yep. We will think about that. Very good. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This was a lot of fun. Looking forward to more discussions with the Return to Moria folks soon. And we'll be back again next week sometime or other.
We'll let you know soon.
All right. Very good. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.